The studio smelled like burnt coffee and stale cigarette smoke. The air had weight to it, the kind that pressed against your chest when you were too tired to fight it anymore. Outside, the sky was still black. Inside, the only light came from the console glow and a single desk lamp angled low over scattered sheet music that no one had looked at in hours. David Lindley sat on a stool near the back wall, his lap steel resting across his knees. His hands weren't moving. His eyes were fixed somewhere past the microphone stand, past the soundproofing foam, past the glass that separated him from the control room. He looked like a man who had run out of answers. Jackson Browne stood on the other side of the glass, leaning forward with both palms flat on the mixing board. His hair hung loose around his face. His shirt was wrinkled. He had not slept. Neither of them had. The engineer had left an hour ago saying he'd be back at sunrise. He wasn't coming back. Everyone knew it. They had been working on the same song for 11 hours. It was supposed to be simple. 3 chords, a melody that moved like water, lyrics about leaving someone you loved because staying would break you both. Jackson had written it in a hotel room in Phoenix 2 months earlier, and when he sang it alone with his acoustic guitar, it felt true. It felt finished. But in the studio with a full band, with drums and bass and electric piano layered in, the song had collapsed. It sounded crowded. It sounded like everyone was trying to say something at once and no one was listening. They had tried 16 different arrangements. They had stripped it down to just guitar and voice. They had built it back up with strings. They had changed the key twice. Nothing worked. By midnight, the bass player had packed up and left without saying goodbye. The drummer stayed until 3, then put his sticks down gently on the snare and said he was sorry, but he didn't know what else to give. Jackson thanked him. He didn't argue. He just sat in the control room with his head in his hands while the studio emptied out. David stayed. David always stayed. He had known Jackson for 4 years. They had met at a club in West Hollywood, back when neither of them had record deals or reputations to protect. David played fiddle and lap steel and slide guitar, and he played them all like he was speaking a language no one else had learned yet. He could make an instrument cry without ever raising the volume. He could fill space without taking it over. Jackson trusted him the way you trust someone who knows when to stop talking. But tonight, David had nothing left. He had played 17 different parts. He had tried melody lines that soared and ones that whispered. He had doubled the vocal. He had played against the vocal. He had tried lap steel, then switched to dobro, then back to lap steel with a different tuning. Every time Jackson asked him to try again, he did. He never complained. He never said it was impossible. But his face had changed. At first he had been focused, then frustrated, then quiet in a way that felt like surrender. Now he just looked empty. Jackson watched him through the glass. He could see David's shoulders rising and falling with each breath, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to keep something inside from spilling out. His hands were still resting on the lap steel, but his fingers weren't moving. He wasn't tuning. He wasn't adjusting. He was just sitting there. Jackson pressed the talkback button. His voice came through the studio speaker, low and careful. One more time. David didn't move. Jackson waited. The hum of the console filled the silence. The tape machine wasn't running. The track wasn't playing. There was no music. Just the two of them, separated by glass and exhaustion and something heavier that neither of them had named yet. David's jaw tightened. He looked down at the lap steel, then back up at the glass. His eyes were red. Not from crying. Not yet. Just from being awake too long, from trying too hard, from carrying a weight that didn't belong to him but that he had picked up anyway because that's what you did for people you cared about. He shook his head once. Slow. Final. "I don't have it," he said. His voice came through the intercom flat and worn. "I don't know what you want." Jackson leaned back in the chair. He rubbed his face with both hands, then let them drop to his lap. He stared at the console, at all the faders and knobs and blinking lights that were supposed to make things sound better but hadn't. He knew David was right. He knew because he didn't have it either. The song wasn't broken because of the arrangement. It wasn't broken because of the key or the tempo or the instrumentation. It was broken because Jackson was trying to make it say something it couldn't say. He was trying to make it sound like resolution when the whole point of the song was that there was no resolution. There was just the ache of walking away and the quiet that came after. He had been trying to fix it, and fixing it was killing it. David was still sitting on the stool, staring at the floor now. His hands had left the lap steel and were hanging loose at his sides. He looked like a man who had failed at something important and didn't know how to make it right. Jackson stood up. He walked out of the control room, pushed open the heavy studio door, and stepped inside. The air was cooler in here, thicker. David didn't look up. Jackson crossed the room slowly, his footsteps muffled by the carpet and foam. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without the intercom, far enough to give David space. "I'm sorry," Jackson said. David lifted his head. His eyes were wet now, but nothing had fallen yet. He blinked once, hard, and looked away. "For what?" he asked. His voice was rough. "For asking you to do something I don't even understand." David let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had any air behind it. He shook his head. "I thought I could hear it," he said. "I thought I could find the thing that would make it work, but I can't. I've tried everything I know." Jackson sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up. He looked at David, then at the lap steel, then at the floor between them. "It's not you," Jackson said quietly. "It's me. I've been holding on to something that doesn't exist. I keep hearing this version of the song in my head, this version where everything feels okay at the end, but that's not the song. The song is about not being okay. And I keep trying to make you play around that, trying to make you fix what isn't supposed to be fixed." David was quiet for a long time. He picked up the lap steel, cradled it in his lap like it was something fragile, and ran his thumb along the strings without pressing down. The sound was soft, metallic, barely there. "What do you need?" he asked. Jackson looked up at him. There was no frustration in David's face now, no exhaustion, just something open and raw, like he had stripped away every layer of protection and was offering whatever was left. "I need it to sound like leaving," Jackson said. "Not like goodbye, not like closure, just leaving. When you walk out the door and you don't know if you did the right thing. When you're alone in your car at 4 a.m. and you don't know where you're going, but you know you can't go back." David nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. He just adjusted the bar in his left hand, moved the lap steel higher on his lap, and closed his eyes. "Play the track," he said. Jackson stood up, walked back into the control room, and pressed play. The tape rolled. The song started, acoustic guitar soft and steady. Jackson's voice tired and true, singing about distance and stillness and the space between people who used to know each other. David didn't wait for a cue. He didn't think. He just let his hands move. The sound that came out of the lap steel was different from anything he had played all night. It wasn't a melody. It wasn't a harmony. It was something underneath both, something that bent and wavered and refused to resolve. It didn't follow the chords. It didn't support the vocal. It just existed beside it, like a shadow that moved on its own. It sounded like loneliness. It sounded like the moment after you've made a decision you can't take back. It sounded like 4 a.m. Jackson stood frozen in the control room, his hand still on the play button, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. He didn't move. He didn't stop the tape. He just listened. David played through the first verse. He played through the chorus. He didn't add anything. He didn't decorate. He just followed the feeling, letting the steel cry in places where words couldn't, letting it pull back in places where silence mattered more. By the time the song reached the second verse, David's face had changed. His eyes were still closed, but his jaw was tight, his mouth pressed into a thin line. His hands were steady, but something in his posture had shifted. His shoulders were trembling. Jackson saw it through the glass. He saw David's chest heave once, saw him suck in a breath that didn't come easy. He saw the tears start, slow and quiet, sliding down David's face without sound, without stopping. David kept playing. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't open his eyes. He just played through it, letting the steel sing while his own voice stayed silent, letting the sound carry what he couldn't say out loud. When the song ended, the tape kept rolling. The studio was quiet except for the hiss of the machine and the soft, uneven sound of David's breathing. He opened his eyes. His face was wet. He lowered the lap steel and set it gently on the floor beside him. Jackson didn't move. He stood in the control room with both hands pressed flat against the glass, staring at the man on the other side who had just given him everything. David looked up. His eyes were red and swollen, but there was no shame in them, no apology, just exhaustion and release and something that looked like relief. Jackson pressed the talkback button. His voice cracked when he spoke. "That's it." David nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, slow and deliberate, then leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes again. Jackson rewound the tape. He played it back. He listened to the whole thing without touching a single fader, without adjusting a single level. He listened to the way David's part moved through the song like a second heartbeat, fragile and relentless, never trying to be louder than it needed to be. It was perfect. Not because it was pretty, not because it resolved, but because it told the truth. When the playback ended, Jackson walked back into the studio. David was still sitting against the wall, his head tilted back, his eyes half closed. He looked like he had just finished running a race he hadn't known he was in. Jackson sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke. They just sat there in the dim light, two people who had pushed each other past comfort and come out the other side, holding something they couldn't have found alone. After a long time, David spoke. His voice was hoarse. "I didn't know I had that in me." Jackson looked at him. "I didn't either." David laughed, quiet and broken. "I thought I was failing you. You were saving me." They sat in silence again. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but the kind of gray that comes before it, when the world is still deciding whether to wake up or stay dark a little longer. "Why did you keep pushing?" David asked. Jackson thought about it. He thought about all the hours, all the takes, all the versions of the song that had sounded fine but had felt wrong. He thought about the moment he had almost given up, the moment he had almost said it was good enough. "Because I knew you could hear it," Jackson said, "even if I couldn't." David turned his head and looked at him. His eyes were clearer now, though still red around the edges. "What if I couldn't? Then we would have stopped, would we?" Jackson didn't answer right away. He didn't know if he was telling the truth, but he wanted it to be true. He wanted to believe that he would have known when to let go, that he would have seen David breaking and stepped back before it went too far. But the truth was he hadn't stopped. He had kept asking, and David had kept trying, and somewhere in that refusal to quit, in that willingness to stay inside the discomfort and the exhaustion and the doubt, they had found something neither of them could have planned. "I don't know," Jackson said finally, "but I'm glad we didn't have to find out." David smiled, small and tired. He closed his eyes again and let his head rest against the wall. "Me too." The tape sat on the machine, still and silent. The song was done. Not finished, just done. There was nothing left to add, nothing left to fix. It would go on the album exactly as it was, raw and unpolished and true. Years later, people would ask Jackson about that session. They would ask him how he knew when a song was ready, how he got performances like that out of people. He would always say the same thing. I didn't get it out of him. He gave it, and I just had to be willing to wait for it. But he never told them about the crying. He never told them about the 11 hours or the empty studio or the moment when David shook his head and said he didn't have it. He kept that part to himself, not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. Some things don't need to be explained, they just need to be felt. In the studio that morning, as the light began to creep through the edges of the soundproofing and the hum of the machines settled into something softer, Jackson and David sat side by side in the quiet. Neither of them moved, neither of them needed to. They had walked through the fire. They had asked too much and given too much and found the edge of what they were capable of. And on the other side of it, there was no victory, no triumph, just the stillness that comes after the storm, when the only thing left to do is breathe. The song would live on. It would play on the radio and in living rooms and in the headphones of people who had never met Jackson or David, but who knew exactly what that lap steel was saying, because they had felt it too. They had stood in that same doorway, that same 4 a.m. moment, and they had chosen to leave even though it hurt. And they would hear David's playing, the way it bent and wavered and refused to resolve, and they would understand. Not because it was explained to them, but because some things don't need words. Some things just need someone brave enough to cry while they play.